process. And also, if I may, on Gaza, the humanitarian situation is dire. The babies have been frozen to death because of the weather. Tents have been flooded. Is this anything that the United States can do to alleviate the suffering of the civilians in Gaza?
Yeah. In the case of the West Bank, we have, and you've seen our embassy even has put out statements and comments about specific incidents there that we're concerned about, that we do think, create a point of strong friction in the broader effort. And our own embassy, and Ambassador Huckabee has spoken to this as recently as a couple weeks ago, very firmly, I believe. And so we'll continue to communicate that as we have and make our opinion known in regards to its impact on the broader challenges. In the case of humanitarian, absolutely. I mean, this is the reason why that group is set up there every single day. We've been successful at opening new corridors. We want to continue to see that increase. We want to continue to see the flow of aid increase into those parts of Gaza that are still under.
You've just watched Secretary of State Marco Rubio stand before the press corps and deliver an answer that should make your blood boil and your mind reel, because when confronted with the reality of babies freezing to death in Gaza, when told directly and explicitly that infants are dying from hypothermia in flooded tents, his response was to talk about corridors and stabilization forces and technocratic governance, about frameworks and coordination centers, and the necessity of political arrangements before humanitarian aid can flow. And what we are witnessing here is nothing short of a moral catastrophe, clothed in the language of bureaucratic necessity, the sanitization of genocide through administrative rhetoric. And this is the moment where you need to understand what is happening, because this isn't an accident or a fumble or a poorly worded response. This is the entire architecture of American complicity laid bare in a single exchange. 8 newborns reportedly died in the Gaza Strip from hypothermia because of the cold winter weather, lack of shelter and winter supplies in less than 3 weeks, and the denial rate for humanitarian missions has reached 70%, marking the highest denial rate in the past 6 months. So when a journalist asks this official about babies freezing to death, the moral universe demands one response and one response only, which is immediate action to stop children from dying. But instead, Rubio offered a masterclass in how empire justifies atrocity through process. The bombshell that you need to grasp immediately is that in January 2024, Israeli authorities blocked 56% of humanitarian aid to northern Gaza, and by December 2024, 70% of UNRWA's missions were denied by the Israeli authorities, meaning that as this official stands there talking about opening corridors and successful coordination, the material reality is systematic obstruction of aid at unprecedented levels. And when he pivots to discussing the need for a technocratic Palestinian Authority and an international stabilization force before aid can properly flow, what he is doing is making humanitarian assistance conditional on political arrangements, which is not only morally obscene, but a violation of international humanitarian law, because the Geneva Conventions do not say that starving children must wait for governance structures to be finalized before they can eat. They do not say that babies dying of cold must wait for an international force to deploy before they can have blankets. The legal and moral imperative is immediate relief, regardless of political conditions. Yet here stands the top American diplomat, essentially arguing that Palestinians must accept a particular political framework, must wait for forces to be assembled, and mandates to be approved and coordination mechanisms to be established, all while children are cold, wet, and barefoot. 3-week-old Saila Mahmoud al-Fasih died on Wednesday, after 2 other babies aged 3 days and 1 month had been brought to the hospital over the previous 48 hours after dying of hypothermia. But wait, because it gets worse. It gets so much worse, and you need to see the full picture of what's happening here, because Rubio announced that he has signed a declaration to expedite the delivery of nearly $4 billion in military aid to Israel, reversing a partial arms blockage imposed during the Biden administration. So in the same breath that this administration talks about humanitarian corridors and aid coordination, they are rushing weapons to the Israeli military, and in October 2024, the United Nations found that Israel had arbitrarily blocked 83% of aid entering Gaza in the prior year. Meaning this is not a logistics problem. This is not about Hamas stealing aid or difficulties with distribution. This is systematic, intentional blockade. And when Rubio frames the issue as needing a stabilization force because only Israelis could currently secure convoys, but that would violate the ceasefire, he is constructing a catch-22 where aid is impossible, where the very military conducting the siege is positioned as the only entity capable of securing aid delivery, but cannot do so because of ceasefire terms, thereby ensuring that no aid arrives. And meanwhile, thousands of people are starving and children are dying. 33% of required food aid does not make it into Gaza, up from 34% in 2023. meaning people in Gaza have gone from having an average of 2 meals a day to just 1 meal every other day. The historical parallel you must understand is that we have seen this before, this same bureaucratic distancing from mass death, this same language of technical impediments masking political will to harm, because when the United States wanted to provide humanitarian assistance during the Berlin airlift, they didn't wait for governance structures and international forces and political arrangements. They flew planes immediately. They acted with urgency because the moral imperative was clear. But when the victims are Palestinian, when the perpetrator of the blockade is Israel, suddenly everything becomes impossibly complex. Suddenly we need coordination centers and stabilization forces and reformed Palestinian authorities, and what Rubio is articulating here is the same logic that has allowed occupation to persist for decades, the same logic that frames Palestinian suffering as a problem requiring Palestinian political concessions rather than as a crime requiring immediate cessation. Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, about how genocide is perpetrated not just by monsters, but by bureaucrats shuffling papers and citing regulations, and that is what you are watching in this clip. A man in a suit explaining with apparent reasonableness why babies must continue to die because the proper administrative structures are not yet in place. And here is the next bombshell you need to absorb, because while Rubio stands there talking about these coordination mechanisms, newborns in the Gaza Strip are dying from hypothermia because of the cold winter weather and lack of shelter, as supplies which would protect them have been stuck in the region for months waiting for approval from the Israeli authorities to get into Gaza, meaning the supplies exist, they are there, they are waiting, and Israeli authorities are simply refusing to let them through. So when Rubio talks about opening corridors and coordination, he is describing a system designed to fail, designed to create plausible deniability while children die preventably, and research and analysis by Refugees International shows that Israeli conduct has consistently and groundlessly impeded aid operations within Gaza, blocked legitimate relief operations, and resisted implementing measures that would genuinely enhance the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. This isn't Hamas stealing food. This isn't logistical challenges in a war zone. This is Israel systematically blocking aid, and the United States providing diplomatic cover for that blockade by talking about processes and arrangements and coordination while shipping billions in weapons. The ideology underlying this response is what Edward Said called Orientalism, the construction of Palestinian life as less valuable, less urgent, less deserving of the immediate mobilization that would occur if white European babies were freezing to death in tents, because make no mistake, if 8 Norwegian infants died of hypothermia in 3 weeks because aid was being blocked, the international community would move heaven and earth. There would be airdrops and emergency interventions, and Security Council resolutions passed within hours, but when the babies are Palestinian, when they die in Gaza under Israeli blockade, suddenly we need to talk about Hamas and governance structures, and the necessity of political frameworks. Suddenly the urgency evaporates and is replaced with this bloodless technocratic language about coordination centers and stabilization forces. The Palestinian writer Rafat al-Lahrir, who was killed by Israeli forces, wrote that if I must die, you must live to tell my story, and what Rubio is doing in this moment is making it impossible to tell that story, wrapping it in so many layers of bureaucratic obfuscation that the fundamental truth becomes obscured, which is that children are dying because aid is being deliberately blocked, and the United States is enabling that blockade. But let's interrogate the West Bank dimension that the journalist mentioned, because Rubio was asked about settler violence and settlement expansion sabotaging peace, and his response was essentially to pivot away to Gaza, but the reality on the ground is that from October 7, 2023 to December 31, 2024, at least 1,860 incidents of settler violence in the occupied West Bank were recorded, an average of 4 a day, with the Nablus governorate seeing the highest number of settler attacks with 411 incidents, followed by 410 incidents in Ramallah and 362 in Hebron, and these are not random acts of violence. Between the beginning of the Gaza war and 30 September 2024, the UN recorded 1,423 settler attacks on Palestinians that resulted in at least 21 fatalities, over 650 injuries and extensive property damage, including the destruction of over 22,000 mainly olive trees and saplings, which for many farmers are the main source of livelihood. This is terrorism, state-backed terrorism, and when you connect this to what's happening in Gaza, you see the larger strategy which is making Palestinian life unlivable across all territories, using different methods in different places, but with the same goal, which is displacement and dispossession, and ultimately elimination. The Trump administration has made this exponentially worse because one of Donald Trump's first actions as president was to lift sanctions targeting numerous far-right settler organizations and individuals involved in violent actions against Palestinians, including arson, property damage, and assaults on civilians, sanctions that were imposed by Biden via an executive order in February 2024. So the United States is not just enabling this violence through diplomatic cover and weapons shipments, it is actively removing the minimal deterrence that existed, and meanwhile, the year 2023 saw the government approve a record number of building permits for new settlement housing units, nearly 13,000, and erect an unprecedented number of new settler outposts, making any two-state solution impossible, making peace impossible. And when Rubio stands there talking about stabilization and reconstruction in Gaza, while his administration enables this expansion in the West Bank, what he is describing is not peace but pacification, not liberation but subjugation. Here is where the intellectual framework of settler colonialism becomes essential to understanding what we are witnessing, because Patrick Wolfe wrote that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, that it operates through elimination of the native to replace them with the settler. And what we are seeing in Gaza and the West Bank simultaneously is that structure in motion, using siege and starvation in Gaza, using violence and displacement in the West Bank, and the United States is not a neutral mediator in this process, but an active participant, providing the weapons and diplomatic cover and economic support that makes it all possible. When Rubio talks about the need for a technocratic Palestinian Authority, he means a leadership that will administer occupation, that will police their own people on behalf of the occupier, that will accept bantustans and checkpoints and walls as the price of limited autonomy. And this is what Frantz Fanon warned about, the way colonial powers create native intermediaries to make oppression more palatable, to give it the appearance of self-governance while maintaining control. The next bombshell that will absolutely enrage you is that from the beginning of the implementation of the ceasefire deal, Israel was consistently accused of violating it by killing Palestinians on a near-daily basis and hindering aid, and following Hamas's refusal to accept a U.S. ceasefire extension proposal, Israel ceased the entry of aid to Gaza on March 20, a humanitarian aid blockade that was condemned by mediators Egypt and Qatar, as well as the United Nations, as a violation of the ceasefire, meaning Israel is using aid as a weapon, withholding food to coerce political concessions, which is the textbook definition of using starvation as a method of war, which is a war crime. As of October 21, the World Food Programme reports that it has been able to bring in less than half the required volume of food aid, despite ceasefire terms requiring 600 trucks per day. So when Rubio stands at that podium talking about coordination and process, what he is actually describing is a system where Israel can violate agreements with impunity, where children can starve as political leverage, and the United States will continue providing diplomatic cover and weapons shipments regardless. The question that should be haunting you, the question that should keep you awake at night, is how many babies have to freeze to death before American officials stop talking about coordination centers and start talking about accountability? How many children have to starve before the United States uses its considerable leverage to demand that Israel allow aid through, because that leverage exists, it is real and substantial, and could be deployed immediately. Since taking office, the Trump administration has approved nearly $12 billion in major foreign military sales to Israel, meaning the United States could pick up the phone today and say that not one more dollar, not one more weapon, not one more diplomatic shield at the UN until every aid truck is allowed through, until every baby has a warm place to sleep, until the blockade ends, but instead Rubio stands there and talks about processes. The media criticism that must be articulated here is that the journalist asked a good question, but the follow-up is everything, because when Rubio pivots to talking about corridors and coordination, the next question must be, Mr. Secretary, with respect, I did not ask you about coordination mechanisms, I asked you about babies freezing to death. Can you explain why the United States continues to provide billions in weapons to Israel, while Israel blocks the aid that would keep those babies alive? Can you explain why aid delivery is being made conditional on political arrangements, when international humanitarian law demands immediate relief, regardless of political conditions? The failure to press, the acceptance of bureaucratic obfuscation as an answer to moral emergency, this is how complicity is maintained. This is how the Overton window shifts until genocide becomes something we discuss in the passive voice, something that is happening rather than something being done, something requiring coordination rather than immediate cessation. And here is the connection to the broader conservative project that you must understand, because what Rubio represents is not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of a worldview that sees certain lives as disposable, certain people as obstacles to be removed, and this is the same ideology that animates anti-immigrant sentiment, that defends police violence, that slashes social programs while increasing military budgets. It is the belief that there is a hierarchy of human worth, and that American power should be deployed to maintain that hierarchy. The conservative movement has long positioned itself as pro-life, as defenders of children, but those same voices are utterly silent as Palestinian children die, revealing that the concern was never about children as such, but about control, about who gets to live, and under what conditions, and according to whose rules. Judith Butler writes about grievable life, about how certain deaths are mourned and memorialized while others are rendered invisible, statistical, mere background noise to geopolitical maneuvering, and watching Rubio's response is watching that process in real time, watching him transform freezing babies into coordination challenges, human catastrophe into administrative problems requiring technical solutions. When he talks about opening corridors, he is not talking about Sila Mahmoud al-Fassi, the 3-week-old whose father held her stiff body in his hands. He is not talking about the mother who told Al Jazeera that, "We sleep on the sand and we don't have enough blankets, and we feel the cold inside our tent." He is not talking about the father who described his baby's body as like wood when he found her unresponsive in the morning. He is talking about metrics and mechanisms and the necessity of political preconditions. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that Rubio and the Trump administration established as an alternative to UN coordination has been an abject failure, and worse than a failure, it has been deadly, because repeated and regular mass shootings and killings at the GHF distribution sites mean they have been described as slaughter masquerading as aid, with survivors of the repeated mass killings calling this Israeli-backed operation traps rather than aid. And since 26 May 2025, the United States and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has facilitated limited and largely ineffective aid distribution, marred by mass killings that resulted in over 1,400 Palestinian deaths. This is the coordination that Rubio is describing. This is the alternative to UN operations that he is defending. A system where people are shot while trying to get food, where aid distribution becomes a killing field, and the Trump administration's response is to double down, to push this system as the model, while blocking UN agencies from operating. The intersectional analysis that progressive movements must center is that this is not separate from struggles for justice at home. This is the same system that militarizes borders and surveils Muslim communities and denies healthcare and housing to the poor, because the logic of disposability is the same. The willingness to let people die for political and economic goals is the same, and what happens in Gaza does not stay in Gaza. The weapon systems are tested there and used here. The surveillance technology is developed there and deployed here. The ideological justification for abandoning the most vulnerable is rehearsed there and repeated here. When police in the United States train with Israeli forces, they are learning the techniques of occupation. When politicians defend Israel's actions, they are normalizing the language of dehumanization that makes all oppression possible. The climate dimension that cannot be ignored is that Gaza is also an environmental catastrophe, because the blockade resulted in a 90% drop in electricity availability, impacting hospital power supplies, sewage plants, and shutting down desalination plants that provide drinking water, meaning people are drinking contaminated water, sewage is flowing untreated, disease is spreading, and this will have generational health impacts. This will poison the land and water for decades. And meanwhile, the same forces denying climate justice globally are the forces enabling this destruction, because fossil fuel interests and arms manufacturers and the politicians they fund understand that climate apartheid and settler colonialism are linked projects, both requiring the sacrifice of certain populations for the benefit of others, both demanding that we accept mass death as unfortunate but inevitable, rather than as a choice being made by those with power. Rubio's language about a technocratic Palestinian authority reveals the entire game, because what he is describing is the Oslo paradigm, the idea that Palestinians will accept limited autonomy in disconnected Bantustans, while Israel controls borders and resources and movement and security, that they will police themselves and suppress resistance and accept permanent subjugation in exchange for the appearance of self-governance, and this has been the American position for decades. This is what the peace process has always meant, not actual justice or freedom, but pacification through economic incentives and security coordination. The Palestinian liberation movement has rejected this framework because it is not liberation, it is administered occupation, and when Rubio talks about the need for this kind of authority before aid can flow, he is making humanitarian relief conditional on political capitulation, saying Palestinians can have food and medicine and warmth for their children if and only if they accept permanent subordination. The urgency that must be communicated is that this is happening now. Today, this moment, as you read these words, children are cold and hungry and afraid. Parents are making impossible choices about which child gets the blanket. Aid workers are watching supplies sit in trucks meters away from people who need them, while Israeli authorities refuse to let them through, and every day of bureaucratic delay is another day of preventable suffering and death. Every day without action steals another day from Gaza's children. Every delay costs more lives, and when officials like Rubio talk about processes and coordination, they are stealing those days, they are choosing those deaths, because the alternative is available, it is possible, it requires only political will. The action that this moment demands is multifaceted, and must be sustained because this is not a problem that will be solved by a single protest or petition. This requires a movement that connects Palestinian liberation to all struggles for justice, that makes support for Palestine a litmus test for progressive politics, that refuses to accept politicians who enable genocide no matter what other positions they claim to hold. You must call your representatives and demand they condition all aid to Israel on ending the blockade. You must support BDS campaigns that impose economic consequences for occupation. You must show up to protests and make Palestine impossible to ignore. You must challenge Zionism wherever it appears, including and especially in progressive spaces. You must educate yourself and others about the history of Palestine and the ongoing Nakba and the framework of settler colonialism that explains what we are witnessing. But beyond individual actions, we need systemic change. We need to dismantle the entire architecture of American empire that makes this possible, the military-industrial complex that profits from endless war, the political lobbying systems that make Palestine toxic for elected officials, the media structures that normalize occupation and frame resistance as terrorism, the educational curricula that teach support for Israel as progressive values. This requires building power, organizing communities, running candidates, transforming institutions, and that work is long and difficult, and absolutely essential because the alternative is accepting that babies will continue to freeze to death while officials talk about coordination. The moral clarity that must be maintained is that nothing justifies this. No security concern, no political complexity, no historical trauma. Nothing justifies blocking aid from starving children. Nothing justifies babies dying of cold in tents. And anyone who tells you otherwise is asking you to accept the unacceptable, to normalize the unconscionable, to participate in atrocity through silence or equivocation. When Rubio stands at that podium and talks about processes while children die, he is asking you to accept that their deaths are unfortunate but necessary, that the proper mechanisms must be in place before they can be saved, and rejecting that logic, refusing that framework, insisting that human life and dignity are not negotiable and not conditional. That is the baseline of moral politics. That is what justice requires. This is what American empire looks like in practice. This is what our tax dollars fund. This is what is done in our names, and we have a responsibility to stop it, not because it will be easy or popular or politically convenient, but because it is right, because those are human beings dying, because those babies deserve to live, because Palestine will be free.